Let's get to our speaker. Ken Dahlin is a Racine-based architect, national award-winning, and specializing in Wright-inspired architecture. He received his doctorate at UW-Milwaukee's School of Architecture and Urban Planning in 2018, and he successfully defended his dissertation, The Aesthetics of Frank Lloyd Wright's Organic Architecture, Hegel, Japanese Art, and Modernism. Congratulations. I've seen several residences that Ken has designed personally, and I can say they're stunning. His work is really great, and please check out his website, genesisarchitecture.com. And we're really pleased that he's here to talk to us today with this interesting topic. So take it away, Ken.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And as others have noted, this is a little bit of a different kind of venue for me, and because I can't see you, but you can see me. So I'll do my best I can, and hopefully this will be informative and interesting to you, and you'll have a chance to give some questions and feedback at the end here. So let me get into it. So today's topic, I want to see what we might learn about the tension between traditionalism and modernism through Frank Lloyd Wright. You know, after all, Wright is a certain bridge from the age of traditional architecture into the modern age of the 20th century. So was Wright a traditionalist, a modernist, or neither? And what can we learn through his interaction with both movements? After 100 years, it seems that the issue of modernism and traditionalism has not gone away. Even today in our culture, there's a conflict between traditional architecture and modern architecture. In 2008, the British organization Intelligence Squared held a debate with the motion offered, Prince Charles was right. Modern architecture is still all glass stumps and carbuncles. The traditionalists in the debate, they argued that traditional architecture is timeless, it's beautiful, and makes for unified and cohesive towns and cities. And they cited polls which have consistently shown that the public prefers traditional architecture over modern architecture. However, those in the modernist camp argued that imitating past forms is mere pastiche, it's fake, it's not honest, as it does not reflect the time and technology of its production. Further, it stifles creativity and originality. More recently, just in this last February, there was a proposed presidential executive order stating that all federal buildings should be built in, quote, the classical architectural style in the guidelines for making federal buildings beautiful again. The AIA, the American Institute of Architects, not surprisingly opposed this order, and they stated, the high bar required to satisfy the process described within the executive order would all but restrict the ability to design the federal buildings under this order in anything but the preferred style. Surprisingly, an article in the Atlantic magazine supported the proposal, with the tagline in their article stating, quote, Trump's beautiful proposal for federal architecture. The classicists hope to address a problem that the architecture establishment does not see as a problem. Well, as someone personally who is in that architectural establishment, I can attest to a certain bias that there is against traditional architecture. Generally, it really isn't even given serious consideration. And you'd be hard pressed to find any schools of architecture in the United States which still teach traditional architecture. There are a handful such as Notre Dame, which not only teaches classical orders, but the handcrafted drawing techniques of the Beaux-Arts style and such. So with that said though, where does Wright fit into this discussion? Most people, most likely that are in this audience today, kind of know the history already of Wright's history. In other words, just before the turn of the 20th century, Wright develops his prairie style of architecture, and he rebels against the traditional architecture everywhere back at that day. And these are just two examples, but I could have used many others. The Winslow House as kind of an important key milestone in his development of the prairie style. 1893, the Willits House just after the turn of the century. But back in Wright's day, what he was rebelling against, if you will, the Greek revival, federal style, Victorian, and so on. And we all know what those are. One of Wright's early manifestos appeared in his essay called In the Cause of Architecture, 1908. It appeared in the Architectural Record. He begins the essay with these words: "Radical though it be, the work here illustrated is dedicated to a cause conservative in the best sense of the word. At no point does it involve denial of the elemental law and order inherent in all great architecture. Rather, it is a declaration of love for the spirit of that law and order and a reverential recognition of the elements that made its ancient letter in its time vital and beautiful." He went on to say that nature originally provided the material for architectural motifs from which the traditional forms, such as the classical orders, were derived, but that for centuries, these had become dead formula which were slavishly copied. We can think of Marc-Antoine Lothier, the image on the left there, the idea of the primitive hut as the origin of the architectural orders or forms as derived from nature, the beginnings of an understanding of the idea of column, entablature, pediments, etc. So Wright's designs in his Prairie Day, they break down the box, they establish long horizontal lines reflecting the prairie, opening up flowing interior spaces. He gets rid of excess ornament. Wright writes about the art and the craft of the machine, and he leads a procession of architects in Europe into the new modernist movement, which is kind of the basic narrative that we know of. So what got the attention of the European architects at the time was what he did with the elements of architecture itself, his decomposition of walls, roofs, and windows into crisp, planar elements. It involved both the fragmenting of these elements out of the common traditional stylistic fabric and recombining them into a new whole. The Wasmuth portfolio of 1910 and 1911 was a key point in this timeline, although this actual publication was very limited in its quantity in its publication run. There was a sense of abstraction in Wright's forms that caught the attention of these younger European architects, such as Gropius, Le Corbusier, and Mies van der Rohe. These architects would later be responsible for the rise of the international style of architecture in Europe that eventually would make its way into mainstream American architecture in the middle of the century. The Roby House had the added connotation of machine power and progress as it sat on its lot, like a modern steamship or a Dämpfer. Like frozen motion, it spoke to the future in a time which saw so much progress in forms of transportation, electricity, audio and visual technology, and so forth. These European architects took from this not everything Wright invested in it regarding organic principles, but what they saw in terms of it as a symbol of the machine, of progress, and also of abstraction. Mies van der Rohe, reflecting on this later in 1946, stated, quote, "At this moment, so critical for us, there came to Berlin the exhibition of the work of Frank Lloyd Wright. The encounter was destined to prove of greatest significance to the development of architecture in Europe. The work of this great master revealed an architectural world of unexpected force and clarity of language, and also a disconcerting richness of form. The dynamic impulse emanating from his work invigorated a whole generation." So while Wright was pleased with being considered the father of modernism, he was not pleased with the progeny which came forth from the European modernists. Wright would instead emphasize the schism between his architecture and European modernism, a schism which only widened in his later years. In 1957, in his book, A Testament, Wright both recognizes his influence on European modernism and his dissatisfaction with the result. He says here, quoting, Nevertheless, the straight line, flat plane effects, the new shapes of shelter I had published in Germany in 1910 and France 1911 have, by stimulating worldwide imitation and some true emulation, scattered far, but as yet no deep satisfaction. This quote unquote modern architecture we see as a negation in two dimensions. An improvement, yes, but with too little evidence of the depths of the architecture conceived according to principle, built from inside outward as organism. The essence of construction itself is yet haphazard or old-fashioned steel framing of the box. Natural elegance, the true serenity due to indigenous character of an organic original, seems likely to be lost, sterilized by studying stylizing or by careful elimination of all ornament and pretty much all but the box frame with a flat lid. The tranquil emphasis on space as the reality of the building is mostly missing. Always new names, but no matter how many, such derivations from the outside in all run dry, unquote. I want to take a moment here to discuss the idea of abstraction, since this is an important point in this discussion. It was this idea of abstraction which the European architects saw in Wright's work, which they admired. But first, a commercial break with some cute dogs. And I can't see if anybody's laughing, so this may not be funny at all, but actually this was seriously part of my discussion. So I've got a picture of dogs here. And I'm going to try to explain this concept a little bit better through it. So conceptually, abstraction happens when I take a series of particular physical things, in this case dogs, and I'm able to unite them in a concept, in this case, the idea of, quote, dog. This requires me to find a unifying essence of dogness, which applies to all these very different particular animals. So in the idea of abstraction, we are finding the universal or the essential idea behind the particular instances of physical things. Dogs is just obviously one example that we can apply that to. Back to architecture. As opposed to traditional Baroque architecture, as the Paris Opera House in the upper left corner, Wright was pointing toward abstraction in his architecture. So here in the Roby House, the walls, the roof, the windows, in this case voids, are separated out and they stand for idealized abstractions of the concept wall, roof, voids for windows. The walls, they're clean, they're unencumbered, and they signify enclosure and spatial definition. The walls are separated from the roof by voids of continuous windows, revealing the concept of openness and of breaking down the box at the same time. The roof is pure and low here, and it denotes the concept of shelter in an elemental form. And just pointing back to the Baroque example of here, the Paris Opera House, obviously it has all those elements, walls, roof, windows and such. The roof, however, it's so heavily cluttered, or maybe I shouldn't use that word, let's say articulated and ornamented, that we lose the abstract idea of those things as it's all blended together in the very complex articulation of the surface treatment. We can also compare Louis Sullivan's use of ornament, the two pictures on the very left, one of the drawings of his ornament and the guarantee building on the lower left corner. And we can compare that to Wright's use of ornament. So obviously we know Wright studied under Louis Sullivan, but he felt that ornament should not be literalistic, but abstract. The tree of life stained glass in the upper left, which is from the Martin House, and then the hollyhock ornament in Los Angeles in the bottom right, are not literal representations of these plants. If we take, for example, the hollyhock house, we can see that the real plant on the left, and then his abstraction of it on the right. While Wright was not looking for literal representation, he was looking to distill the underlying geometric essence that all hollyhocks have in common. In other words, the hollyhockness of the plant. We have here the symbol and a referent. The design is a sign or a symbol, and it points to or stands in for a referent of the actual hollyhock plant. And this is what Wright refers to as organic ornament, not the literal representation of a plant, but abstracted and also integrated into the architecture as a unified whole. Wright also saw in this form of abstraction, or he saw this form of abstraction in the Japanese painters like Hokusai, as seen in his manga book here. And this was an influential book on Wright. And he points out, Wright that is, points out the underlying geometric order with which Hokusai was able to create the final forms of his animals and of nature, for example. However, in the European modernist movement, abstraction was taken somewhat differently than Wright's use of it, which is an important distinction. Of course, ornament itself is dispensed with completely, which Wright did not do. The architecture as well is an abstraction. The white walls of the international style try to purify the architecture from any representation and make it pure geometric abstraction. If we look at parallels in the modern art movement, such as abstract expressionism, and Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko's examples are in the bottom there, both about 1950. It's not an attempt to distill any essence from an underlying referent. It is what it is, and it represents nothing other than itself as ink on canvas. Modernism rejects the idea of essences, in fact. Wright also advocated simplification in architecture, but international style modernism was a different type of simplification, a reductionism without an underlying expression of the nature of the thing. This is why Wright could talk about following the idea of simplicity, and yet he produced very complex designs. Wright called this the, quote, essence lying beneath aspect, unquote. He also disliked their propensity for boxy architecture, the very thing he was attempting to break out of. Missing too, in his opinion, was a real sense of spatial depth and character. Finally, he implicates the movement as an avant-garde, stylistically driven movement, marketing itself into popularity and hence missing the deeper connection to nature or the human soul. It's helpful for a moment to remember that Wright's life spanned from the end of the Civil War to the beginning of the space age, 1867 to 1959. Wright found inspiration in people like Wordsworth, Emerson, Coleridge, Beethoven, Bach, and Goethe. He was rooted in the idealism and romanticism of the 19th century. The emerging modernism that Wright saw developing in the early 20th century was not just an architectural style, but an all-encompassing movement which covered architecture, art, music, philosophy, and taste culture. It set the tone for the avant-garde high culture of the 20th century. In fact, if we look at some of the principles of modernist art, as listed by the Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset in his book, The Dehumanizing of Art, 1925, we see clues which became important when trying to understand Wright's antipathy to European modernism. I've listed some of the characteristics that Gasset spells out here. He says some of the characteristics of modern art are that it dehumanizes art, it avoids living forms, art is nothing but a work of art, in other words, art for art's sake, and it's not functionally derived nor needing to represent anything. Art is essentially ironic. It was coined by Philip Johnson, and Henry Russell Hitchcock in their book, The International Style, Architecture Since 1922, and its accompanying exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art. The goal of this work was to assert that there was a new modern style of architecture. Unlike those eclectic styles of the past tradition, which were applied like a garment and changed at will, the international style was one which was promoted as a rational outgrowth of functional grounding. We saw the buzzwords: form follows function, a machine for living. Its family resemblances, despite the varied locations they occurred, would be the result of the true modern condition from which it arose. However, there were some problems with their assumptions. Why would buildings which followed functional needs be so uniformly similar given the many diverse environments, cultures, and means of production around the world? And further, what actually does it mean to say that form follows function? Can you ever really adequately define all the functional requirements of a building? And does it follow that only one form can be the solution to a functional need? Why not two or more appropriate forms? Who is to say that there's a one-to-one correspondence between function and form? Lastly, it denies the reality that buildings change function and ownership in their lifespan. Is there something that transcends function, which determines whether a building survives or is quickly torn down for something new, perhaps like character and beauty? Le Corbusier reflected the break with the past and a hope in a rationally determined future in several of his writings. In 1920, in his Towards a New Architecture essay, he said that, quote, "We must create the mass production spirit, the spirit of living in mass production houses. If we eliminate from our hearts and minds all dead concepts in regard to the house and look at the question from a critical and objective point of view, we shall arrive at the house machine," unquote. Then in 1926, in his 5 points toward a new architecture, he stated, quote, "The 5 essential points set out above represent a fundamentally new aesthetic. Nothing is left to us of the architecture of past epochs, just as we can no longer derive any benefit from the literary and historical teaching given in schools." The German philosopher and sociologist Jürgen Habermas points out the contradiction in the modernist architecture movement. He states that modernist functionalism was based on the idea that forms should express the use functions for which a building is produced. Yet there was actually a false concept at play here, since what modern architecture was actually doing was concealing the fact that it was based on an autonomous system of aesthetic rules. While the international style was based on the manifesto of form arising out of functional necessity, much like the steamship, automobile, and airplane, according to Habermas, in actuality, it was following the experimental trail of avant-garde painting. The problem with this avant-garde approach is that it is self-referential. There is a code, a certain code which unlocks its meaning, but that code is only known by the initiated or the highbrow culture. In the self-referential nature of modernism, it isn't possible to acquire taste through universal principles, natural law, history, or common experience. This is because the code does not reside in these universal things, but rather in the socially constructed system which serves to legitimize its own taste culture. However, organic architecture continually refers beyond itself, such as to nature, to humanity, even tradition. However, by doing so, by using this universal measuring standard, Wright also places himself in the class of the commonplace and the middle brow. Wright was acutely aware of his position in the taste culture of the day and how after initial enthusiasm for his work, he was passed by as no longer relevant. We might recall here Philip Johnson's statement that Wright was the greatest architect of the 19th century, which was taken as the insult that Johnson intended it to be. Wright's perception of his own status outside of the avant-garde circle of modern architects. Wright emphasized the arbitrary nature of the avant-garde of the time. In 1931, he declared, quote, "This modern constructive endeavor is being victimized at the start by a certain new aesthetic wherein appearance is made an aim instead of character made a purpose. The new aesthetic thus becomes at the very beginning old because it is only another appliance. The French, with all the delicacy and charm they seem to possess as substitute for soul, and with French flair for the appropriate gesture, initiators of so many art movements that prove ephemeral, they recognize the opportunity for another movement." Referring back to Wright's 1908 In the Cause of Architecture essay, Wright said that there was no source so fertile and helpful for the architect as a comprehension of natural law, and that it was the Japanese culture which best was able to connect art with nature and avoid the rupture between nature and art that we saw in the modern movement. Hilde Heinen, the professor of architectural theory in Belgium, stated that modern people experience themselves as rootless and not in harmony with themselves, lacking a frame of reference of norms and forms that are traditionally supplied in society. By contrast, Wright would emphasize his theory as radical in the definition of meaning in the sense of being of the root. He claimed to be going further back than the classical and traditional styles themselves to the spiritual root of architecture. The early modernist architect, Adolf Loos, in the upper left corner here, also saw this fissure between tradition and the modern condition, but said that it was the task of individuals and artists to look for a new basis of culture, not through a continuation with tradition, but through a new avant-garde. Later, the art critic Clement Greenberg, in the lower left, who was so influential in a and to universal timeless principle, but was this conscious rupture with the past a necessary precondition for creativity, for progress and culture in the 20th century? Or was that imposed by the avant-garde class? And might that rupture with our past have something to do with the loss of meaning in the modern world? Wright saw organic architecture, and the home in particular, as a complete work of art. The building is not one thing and the furnishings another, but the site, the building, the furnishings should all become part of the character of an integrated whole or unity. Wright's organic architecture went past Kant's opposition between subjective thinking and objective things into Hegel's unity and reconciliation of them as truth. In organicism, the oppositions of modernism and classicism are overcome, and a third way is possible. The conflict between the avant-garde and the rearguard is unnecessary in organic architecture. The traditionalists tend to reject anything that does not have historical precedent, while the modernists reject any references to tradition or its principles. I believe Wright was in fact providing a framework which does not reject the past nor historical principles, and yet it allows for creative expressions in each time and place, not based on arbitrary impulses toward novelty, but on unchanging principles. This means that the resulting works of architecture are open to review by the entire culture that they are being built in. Rather than an elite code known only to the avant-garde, it is an architecture as an outgrowth of nature, time, place, and culture. There should be an innate or intuitive resonance you experience in this architecture. It isn't that you need to learn a privileged code before you can appreciate the architecture. Rather than a rupture with the past, it has roots into the origins of the great historical styles and seeks to find inspiration in the spirit of what brought these styles about, rather than to copy the external forms which arose out of specific times and cultures. So rather than art as subjective, organic architecture seeks an authenticity and beauty which is objective. In modernism, when one says something is beautiful, it is saying something about the observer rather than the object. In traditional philosophy, it is saying something about a quality of the object itself that the object has. I have found Wright's architecture still fascinates those who experience its spaces after all these years. Even today, the avant-garde often relegates his work to kitsch. But by whose standards are we to judge Wright? Through modernism, postmodernism, deconstruction, object-oriented ontology? I find that Wright's enduring appeal to be one of the truest evidences, however, of its value. And this appeal goes beyond the fads of fashion, and it touches on the transcendent values which relate to our humanity as persons. It elevates the soul because philosophically, the human is not just reduced to material matter or biological machine. Modernism could not give us that, and Wright knew that. Wright's principles, which are really not his own, tie us back into nature, into a unity rather than a disconnection from what preceded us. His organic architecture is about the relationship among the parts into a teleology of unity and the whole. And we as persons find a place in harmony with the built environment because we are in a symbiotic relationship. Everything speaks to each other in the design in a harmony of proportion and detail. And aesthetics is essential in Wright's organic architecture because it is not only visual data, but it's the instantiation of idea, with a capital I, as he often did, and of that which transcends external matter. It is at its highest when it points beyond itself, beyond its own materiality. This was the ideal for Wright and those connected into the timeless tradition. Architecture could thus inspire in beauty because it could convey meaning. Modernism, with its scientific reductionism, is always limited to the immanent and phenomenal. I personally believe that one reason Wright's architecture fascinates is because it is always making these gestures beyond itself. If you're in its space, each viewpoint, each space in itself is incomplete, and it's subordinate and defers to niches, to spaces just beyond itself. It's drawing you beyond. It's always pointing beyond because it's trying to create a greater whole in something bigger than itself, not only with our perceptual experience and with the natural environment, but with the mystery of the human spirit. And in my dissertation, I had done more work on Hegel's idea of the unified whole and the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis that I can see in organic architecture, which I won't be able to get into here. But there's a really interesting tie-in with Hegel and with Wright. But let me just continue with this line of thought that I've started here. So Wright gave the example of the materialist of his day as like one who would take off the top of a drum to see where the sound came from. But the meaning is not found in reductionism, but in the whole. This speaks just as strongly to today's age, which tries to reduce life to material matter and subsequently can find no place for value and for meaning. So where does that put us today? Modernism, as a cohesive movement, has been critiqued and found wanting by postmodernism. Venturi and Scott Brown's work in the 1970s showed the importance of signs and symbols and opened up a richer and more complex vocabulary by bringing in historical references. But postmodernism's historical pastiche soon wore thin and was very short-lived. Deconstructionists like Derrida deconstructed the Enlightenment foundations upon which modernism was founded. There's a fragmentation of styles and modes of architecture today, and no single preferred architecture. We have advanced tools today that allow us to make architectural gestures, like the example in the upper left corner. But the question remains, why? The significance wears very thin. There's a temptation today to make Wright fit into the narrative of our 21st century lenses. In other words, Wright the modernist, Wright the precursor to sustainable design and environmentalism, Wright the first biophilic architect, Wright the experimentalist. But if that's all the farther we go, we will still be missing foundational aspects of his work and his theory. I think the challenge is to go back and to try to understand him in his age and context. While we may not agree with everything we find there, we may also find something that speaks back to our time, to our age, and say something and speak into what we ourselves have lost. The debate in the end is not modernism versus traditionalism. It's not either or. There is a middle way, a third way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ken. That was wonderful. As somebody who spends a bit of time talking about abstraction and her presentations, I found some of that language very helpful and different and thought-provoking. So thank you. It's wonderful. We do have some very thoughtful questions as well. So are you ready to take some?
Go ahead.
Okay. I do want you to know that some people reassured you that they were laughing at the dog slide.
Okay, thank you.
That's the first thing we have to get out there. One question asks about Wright and Sullivan, and the question is, what was Wright's main criticism with Sullivan, his employer? And that's not anything you addressed today, but maybe you'd like to.
Of course, Wright went out of his way to honor Sullivan, his Liebermeister, his master, beloved master. And I don't, and he acknowledges him and his influence in the roots of his own development of organic architecture. So Wright saw Louis Sullivan as beginning this path of modernism. I think Wright, maybe less a criticism and more of the idea that he was carrying on the torch, he was carrying it to the next level, he was taking it further. And one of the key areas where he felt he was doing this is in the idea of abstraction. Sullivan's ornament, as I had shown in that one slide, is very literalistic, and Wright, as kind of this transition into the 20th century and into this modernism, depending how you define that, sees the need to abstract, that to find the essences lying under that and find a more pure and simple abstraction of these elements. And the other key, I think, that he would have, and I'm sure this is not exhaustive, obviously, where he might have had some critique to Sullivan, but I think he saw Sullivan, his organicism, if you will, as more two-dimensional. So Sullivan was brilliant in his use of ornament, even organic ornament, as Wright would call it, but in the sense of taking the idea of organic into the third dimension, into the spatial flow. I think that wasn't really there as strongly in Sullivan, in Wright's mind.
Thank you. Glenn asks, do you know of any instances where abstractions in concrete were polychromatic, similar to the leaded glass windows in the Prairie buildings?
In Wright's architecture, I assume the question is referring to in concrete?
I assume so. Mm-hmm.
That's a good question, and I am trying to think if I can think of any exceptions, and I don't, because Wright was after the honest expression of the materiality. So concrete, this very plastic element with all these different potentials, yet he wanted to bring out the texture of the aggregate, the sand and such. Even with his plaster work, he didn't just paint the plaster, it had this integral staining and color to it. And so, no, I'm not aware. Perhaps there's an exception, most likely in some future, subsequent owner who desecrated it or something, but no, I'm not aware.
Okay. Susan adds that Philip Johnson later took the insult back about Wright being the best architect of the 19th century, I presume, after Falling Water. She wanted to add that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. What are the names of the two houses that were on the House Beautiful cover?
One was Taliesin, the living room in Taliesin North. And the other one, I don't know if Terry Boyd actually might be listening to this webinar, but that was from the cover of her book. And might that be the Palmer House in Michigan? I'm not sure actually.
We'll wait and see if she chimes in here.
Okay.
Bob Hartman asks, in your opinion, who produced the best modern furniture, Wright or the international style architects Corbusier, Breuer, and so forth?
Speaking as somebody unbiased, I don't claim any neutrality here. In terms of pure sophistication, you think of the international style furniture as chrome and more metals, and Wright, the use of wood. Wright's barrel chair, the Prairie era, I think is exquisitely done. If you look at something like the butterfly chair, the plywood chair, you could say that the fit and finish isn't as of high caliber, but nor was it meant to be. It was meant to be more common. So of course, I see his furniture as organic and complete, integrating into his architecture. That's my preference, of course. There's been some wonderful modernist furniture, of course, that we all recognize.
Coming down on the side of Wright, though, it sounds like.
Yeah, that's my opinion.
Yeah, of course. Don asks, could you expand on how Wright used Hegel's dialectic in his works?
Yes. So the idea is, and I have a chapter in my dissertation on this. So we're trying to find a third way. So, and I hope not to diverge from your question too much. I'll try to come back to the specific thing. Any architect, when he's solving a problem, you've got a site, you've got a client, you have a budget, you've got all these things to resolve. There tends to be limits and things that conflict, and we instead of trying to find, we have polarities, let's say, the budget, this or that, but we're trying to find a third way. And often it finds expression, just to cut to the chase, in an asymmetry that seeks to find a higher resolution of the problem than a straightforward. And this is, as a designer, I can kind of picture it better than I can explain this, I guess. Something that doesn't resolve itself as a design problem, when you say have a classical symmetrical facade, might find a resolution when you break it up into an asymmetry. You move the entrance over, you're able to do something. The key is you still are finding a solution, a resolution, or the proper word is a unity, a whole, an integrated whole into that. So Wright started his architecture learning the classical motifs and symmetry, and then over the years he broke out of the symmetry into very asymmetrical modes, as in his Usonian and later periods. So I would say that just about everything, you look at the Jacobs 1 Usonian, for example, it's asymmetrical. You've got not just the living room that is complete in itself. You've got the living room that flows into the dining, which flows into the kitchen. So the living room is not complete without the whole. When he talks about the entity of the integrated whole, we were talking about something where the parts are subordinate to a greater whole. There's a teleology in mind. There's a greater whole in mind that happens when one part defers to another. And I apologize, I'm probably making that very obscure.
No, I think that's a great answer. Thank you. We have a question about influence. Anne asks, after just finishing the Anthony Olafson book, Frank Lloyd Wright, The Lost Years, A Study of Influence, the question of influence remains unresolved in many minds. How has thinking developed since the 1993 publication, both in terms of Wright being influenced by perhaps European and Japanese sources, or vice versa? Did that make sense?
Yeah, no, I know where she's coming from. And I have not read his book in whole. I've read parts of it. I think the current thought is that we need to be careful with attributing too much influence to where it's derived, because we can never prove that. There's been other books on Wright that show how his work was derived from Japanese architecture, looking at certain temple forms and Unity Temple and seeing how, if you look at it abstractly in a diagram, how they're very similar. So you can go through those exercises, but they never totally prove anything. And I think I even wrote a little bit about that. There's always other ways, other lines of approach, other influences where a certain form could be derived, even though it may seem obvious. When you're dealing with architecture, and particularly in basic plan motifs, there's not an infinite number of arrangements of basic forms and arrangements. So he could have totally invented Unity Temple with no influence from the Japanese temple. There may have been something, it may have been unconscious, he may have been influenced and he doesn't know it. So I don't know that there is a sense that we can know definitively these things. I'm not aware that anybody's put a definitive line of influence of Wright. I don't think that is actually possible.
Yeah, that's a question we're all scratching our heads about for years.
I think what I was trying to do when I had worked on Wright, and certainly I've got a chapter on the Japanese connection with Wright, and maybe I crossed the line a bit, but I try to be careful not to say that Wright derived this from Japanese art. What I try to say instead is there's a kinship to Wright and Japanese art, and if there's anything that Wright, in his own words, admits to influence, it's the Japanese art. He actually says Japanese, he quite directly says, point blankly, he was not influenced by Japanese architecture, he was influenced by Japanese art. So that again doesn't mean that's the case. You know, subconsciously maybe there's other things happening. But I think you have to look at his words, and then you need to look at his works and see what we can derive from there. And I find that, just as Wright said, an examination of Japanese art is an extremely rich trove of treasure to start to understand his principles, his architecture. I'm not as concerned to say that, well, this Japanese painting, this Japanese architecture has a one-to-one correspondence with this particular building he did. I prefer to see how did it impact or play on his overall theory of organic architecture. I think that's more fruitful to look at the main veins of principle or ideas theory that he had.
Great. We have confirmation in our Q&A here that the Palmer House is featured on the cover of House People. Thank you, Michael. Our friend Henry St. Maurice asked the question, please expand on your comment about interior spaces. Fascist architects in both traditional and modernist schools envisioned soaring spaces that diminish inhabitants. Many of Wright's interior spaces are more intimately human scale. Would this be an example of Wright's opposition to modernism?
I don't develop that in this talk, but I see what you're saying. I think I would say yes halfway on that, simply just because tall soaring spaces are not simply a modernist thing, they're a traditional classicist thing as well. So, you know, it's not limited to modernism. So having said that disclaimer, I would say that Wright's spaces absolutely convey his organic idea of connection to the human scale, intimacy in space, the connection to the human spirit. Absolutely. So I agree with that. And that would be in opposition to both sides, to certain classical art, traditional, certain modernism. So I think modernism can be intimate as well, you know, as well as traditional. So in itself, it's not conclusive there.
I've got one more. You've been taking these questions very very graciously, and I've got one last goodie for you.
Okay.
This says, what does it mean that Wright designed from the inside out, and how is this organic? Isn't organic not both ways, i.e. also by the response to the context, which often in Wright's case was nature, for example, in his buildings in gardens, forests, and suburbs, or in closing off from his surroundings like the Johnson Wax building, where he makes a windowless multi-story building to shut off the dreary surroundings?
Yes. Oh, that's a very good question. And I'd love to spend an hour just on that. So I guess the secret here among designers is, you're right. As a rhetorical device, if you will, he talks about the inside from outside. And I shouldn't be so sarcastic about that. There truly is a principle of organic design, that there's this seed idea, this germ that generates from within, and it's how the spaces develop and envelope the human in the sense of shelter. But having said that, yeah, Johnson Wax is a good example. You've got the this entity, this formal expression of a very regular building, and how it addresses the sidewalk, the street, the block that it's on. So I actually absolutely do not believe it's either or. This is very akin to something else that Wright said, where he wanted his buildings, you know, the deconstruction of the box, you know, the idea of dissolving the walls and letting inside outside flow, you know, let the outside flow in, let the inside flow out spatially. Well, there's a problem with that, in that you dissolve that wall to a certain point and you've dissolved the sense of space. And to an extent, that's what modernism did. And if you actually look carefully at his work, you'll see there's a very careful articulation and modulation of defining spaces. What defines space? Well, those are physical elements. They're floors, they're walls, they're roofs, and different things like that. And there's this sense of openness and flow of space, but then there's always this sense of containment. Like he always used to quote of Lao Tse, the essence of architecture is not in the walls and the roof, but it's the space within. But if you dissolve the walls off, then what happens to that definition of space? So there's a contradiction there actually in those two concepts that he plays out. And it's actually not wrong, I think. It's that he's not articulated that concept fully. And this is where Hegel comes in, and maybe I'm answering someone else's question there. It's not either or. It's not the interior space or the total openness and dissolving of barriers between inside and outside. It's both and in a higher way. And whether he articulates this or verbally or not, he's a master of actually designing things that actually do that. Like if you're looking at falling water on the screen here, wonderful sense of a spatial enclosure, but then these penetrations of space that just go out, and it focuses, it frames your experience. And I don't know of an architect as masterful at doing that as he was. So as I've looked at his rhetoric and the words that he said, you know, I have to temper that and then balance that with the actual architecture. So perhaps his architecture is better than his theory, but he certainly went a long way with the theory as well.
That's great. I lied. One more quick question, because
that's fine.
also have this question in my mind, and that is, what is the image of the building on the bottom right of the screen showing right now? What is that building?
Bottom right. Oh, Daniel Liebeskind's museum edition. I think that's the German museum. I'm not actually, a lot of these images I just used as kind of placeholders without needing to go on to describe it. But Daniel Libeskind is known for this kind of deconstructionist, like these shards, these crystalline forms. So it wasn't making so much a narrative on that as to describe kind of contemporary architecture today.
Yeah, yeah, really interesting. Well, thank you so much, Ken. This was terrific, and we really had some
You're
good
welcome.
conversation here. I feel like each lecture we do leads to more topics we might consider addressing in the future, and this was just terrific. And I want to thank our attendees today for your questions and for joining us. So stay tuned. We will do these lectures on a monthly basis, and the September date is nearly confirmed, so we will send that out shortly. Don't forget that you can use that email that comes out a day or so after this presentation to communicate to me. And thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.